I want to share with you all tonight. I'll speak for about an hour or so about the text of the New Testament. And I'm really addressing the question is, how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament text over the centuries? We've heard a lot of things about scribal corruption. And if you are listening to any kind of internet anonymous speakers, skeptics, they're just going to say it's like the telephone game and things like this. So we're going to address a number of those issues. We'll talk about a couple of actual textual problems and how to deal with those. But the bottom line question on all this is, how much does this affect our faith? Is our faith based on a shaky foundation? We don't really know what the New Testament originally said, or do we have some sense of assurance that what we've got is what they wrote back then? So I'm going to begin with, I'm going to be showing a slideshow while I'm talking. You'll get to see that, and we'll see how this goes. So Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, that's an organization I founded in 2002. And our initial task, as Chris mentioned, is to go all over the world and digitize manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, post them online for free forever for anyone. If you just go to csntm.org, you'll be able to see what we're doing. And I'll just leave it at that. It's you can actually type in a verse of scripture, and it'll populate with the manuscripts that actually have that verse, just the New Testament, that actually have that verse, and show you the actual page where it is. Now, if you don't know Greek, that's about as far as you can go. But if you do know Greek, you still got to figure out how to read those ancient scripts. So it's fun. We've got a lot of videos, podcasts. We're starting to do a lot more podcasts, and we're starting to go to churches to give something like a 3-part or a 7-part series on either the canon of the New Testament, which books are in, which books are out, and why, or the 7-part series on the texts of the New Testament, where we're really developing the whole idea of this field known as textual criticism, which is what CSNTM is all about. Textual criticism has to do with ascertaining the wording of the original of a document that no longer exists or is lost or has turned to dust from the available copies. So without further ado, let's get into this. So what I want to speak about is how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? And let me begin with that great scholar, Dan Brown, in his book, The Da Vinci Code. You might, I know you guys can't speak in this, but I hope you catch a little bit of my semi-dry sense of humor. Obviously, we should know Dan Brown is not a scholar. But he says here, the Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. Well, someone a little bit more serious would be Kurt Eichenwald, who wrote the Bible so misunderstood it's a sin 12 years ago in Newsweek, just before Christmas. It's interesting that skeptics like to get their skepticism out right around Christmas and Easter every year in newspapers, magazines, internet, television, whatever they can to influence the public away from trust in Jesus. So he has a section. This is Newsweek, which used to be a reputable news magazine. And he's got this section called Plain Telephone with the Word of God. Here's what he has to say. Oops, he's saying it again. No television preacher has ever read the Bible. Neither has any evangelical politician. Neither has the Pope. And neither have I. And so far, he may be right. And neither have you. At best, we've all read a bad translation, a translation of translations of translations of hand-copied copies of copies of copies of copies, and on, hundreds of times. Now, the way I'm reading what he's saying here is we can't even get close to the original of the New Testament. We have to get to it through some other translation that has been a translation of an earlier translation in a different language, That's been a translation of an earlier translation in a different language. Finally, it gets back to the Greek, but were removed hundreds of copies later in English. Is that really the case? Well, we'll take a look at this and see. A little bit more seriously is C.J. Werleman, who is an outspoken atheist. He likes to write rather provocative titled books. His first book was God Hates You, Hate Him Back. Well, that was a good one for an atheist to write, because think about this. Really, if there is no God, then maybe the title of the book should be Nothing Hates You, Hate Nothing Back. But his second book, Jesus Lied, He Was Only Human, and here he is hooked up to a lie detector. We do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when, and we don't know by whom. What we have are copies of copies. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. Well, that sure sounds a whole lot better than what Eichmann said, but it's still not quite the truth. Now, here's an even more serious author, and this was the leading British Muslim apologist up until a few years ago when he died. In his book, The History of the Quranic Text, from Revelation to Compilation, where he's just doing an apology for the Quran against the New Testament and the Old Testament, he has this to say: the Orthodox Church, being the sect which eventually established supremacy over all the others, stood in fervent opposition to various ideas, also known as heresies, which were in circulation. These included adoptionism, the notion that Jesus was not God but a man; Docetism, the opposite view, that he was God and not man; and separationism, that the divine and human elements of Jesus Christ were actually two separate beings. In each case, this sect, the one that would rise to become the Orthodox Church, deliberately corrupted the scriptures so as to reflect its own theological visions of Christ while demolishing that of all rival sects. In other words, in AD 325, when Emperor Constantine convened the first ecumenical council of churches that was meant to represent all the churches in the ancient world at that time, Constantine was the first Christian emperor. And in 325, there was this Council of Nicaea. I was actually just in Nicaea just in last October. So it was I guess that makes it the 1700th anniversary of when this council met. It's in Turkey, and there's nothing to see there, but it was, what a historic moment for me to be able to actually stand in the very place where they had this meeting. So the argument is that Constantine invented the deity of Christ, and he destroyed all the manuscripts that were produced before that time, before 325, which would have had various views, but certainly not this Orthodox Church's view that Christ was in fact God. But these are not biblical scholars. Here we do have a biblical scholar. His name is Bart Ehrman. He's a Moody Bible College alum. From there, he became a Christian when he was in high school, went to Moody Bible College. From there, he went to Wheaton College, a very fine evangelical school, got his college degree there, learned some Greek there. And then he went on to Princeton Seminary to study under Bruce Metzger, one of the greatest textual critics of the 20th century, who was also a very fine evangelical scholar. And he got his master's degree under Metzger and then his doctorate under Metzger. And Bart and I have known each other for 44 years. We've actually debated 3 times in public about the text of the New Testament. He lost his faith somewhere along the line, and then he wrote his first New York Times bestseller, Misquoting Jesus, back in 2005. And it's not only is the title misleading, but the picture here is misleading. It's misleading because there's almost nothing in the book about what Jesus has to say. It's what others have to say. But the other thing is the picture here is misleading because it's got a Hebrew text here and it's upside down. The New Testament was written in Greek. So I'm not sure who put this together, but it's pretty bizarre. His opinion is one that we need to reckon with because it's a serious opinion, and he is the number one apologist for atheism who has credentials in America today. He said, not only do we not have the originals, we don't even have the copies of the originals. The first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the originals or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. Notice he's going down 3 generations. Now, this fellow from Newsweek took it to 20 generations. He actually just made that up. He's talking about us or the New Testament having a telephone game as the way we learned of it. But what this Newsweek author did was he took what Ehrman has said and turned it into 20 generations of copies and completely turned what his critique of the Bible is into a telephone game itself. So Ehrman later in the book says, the more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws from them. This is similar to what Al-Azami was saying. But Ehrman is the primary source that these skeptics appeal to, and he's constantly appealed to today by skeptics of all stripes. As we begin this study, there's 2 attitudes that we need to avoid. And the first one is going to be pretty easy, I think, for most of you, because my understanding is that at least most of you are Christians in some sense. And it's the attitude of radical skepticism. I've just given you a few quotes from radical skeptics. And their view is neither logical nor empirically based. It's too far. It's too far away from reality. And even Bart Ehrman doesn't say things nearly as radical as this. In fact, in academic settings, he says things that he and I would agree on almost right down the line. So when it comes to the popular settings, then he makes these kinds of statements that sound so desperate that it just creates chicken littles that we should turn away from the Christian faith. It's interesting that I think in the last 20 years or so, about 2/3 of the kids who come from Christian homes, once they go to college, no longer darken the door of a church. The reason? It's the skepticism that's taught at universities is a major part of it. And the required reading from Bart Ehrman is a major part of that. That's the first attitude. We know we should avoid that, but I'll give you some historical, empirical reasons why it's also important to avoid that attitude. But here's the other, and that's the attitude of absolute certainty. We sometimes think that, well, the Bible is the Word of God. Every single word in the Bible is the Word of God, and therefore I am absolutely certain that this is the Word of God. What Bible are you using? First of all, is it a translation? There's always something lost in translation. There's no 2 languages that map exactly the same. We have 4 different words for love in Greek, and we have just the one in English. And what do they mean? They have shades of difference. But it's not just that Greek sometimes has more words for our English one. There are plenty of times where English has far richer vocabulary than Greek does. And so to nuance these things and get the translation right is tricky. It's never a one-to-one mapping. So even the vocabulary is a little different. The syntax is different, the word order, things like that. There's so many differences between Greek and English that if we use an English translation, we certainly cannot say that we know absolutely that every word in this translation is the Word of God. But where does that put us? Well, let's say, I guess you could go back to the King James and say, well, that's a perfect translation. And I've actually met a couple of people who, in all seriousness, believed this. They said, if the King James Bible was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. Now, one of these guys was from Texas. The other was from Ohio. But the guy from Texas, I thought, I need to maybe adjust the conversation level to what he can handle. So I said, well, how about them Cowboys? And went on from there. So we have to be careful about that too. If we say too much, then we put egg on our face. And I'm just going to mention a book here that I think is really helpful for all of you to think about. And that is, it's called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. Now, Chris, I don't know if you do this, but perhaps you can send out some of these books that I may be mentioning from time to time here to folks so that they can find out about them. This is a book published by InterVarsity Press. I wrote the foreword to it, and two former employees at the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, one of them, in fact, was one of my interns, and he came from Moody Bible College to study textual criticism with me at Dallas Seminary. He got his doctorate from Cambridge, and now he's a professor at Phoenix, or Midwestern Baptist, I think.
Dr. Wallace, we'll put those links in the chat for people to click on in Amazon.
Oh, terrific. That's a great way to go. Peter Gurry and Elijah Hickson are the two editors. I wrote the foreword, but they had a lot of different newly minted PhDs write chapters about how evangelical apologists say too much when it comes to the evidence. The one thing that we need to be known for is telling the truth, not twisting it to our own advantage, but telling the truth. And one of the things I taught my boys growing up was, I know that you have integrity when you tell me something that is to your disadvantage. That's when I know I can begin to trust you. It's an important lesson for all of us. When we share the gospel with others, when we share our faith, when we share the evidence for the gospel and for the New Testament, for the historicity and deity of Christ and miracles and all that, let's not say more than what the evidence reveals. Okay, now, two issues or two attitudes to avoid, three issues to address. And that's what we'll talk about for the rest of the time here. And then I'll open it up for as extended a Q&A as I can handle with you all tonight. We'll just see how long I can go. How much did the scribes corrupt the New Testament is the first question. Secondly, how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? And these two differences have to do with quantity and then quality, or number and nature. That is the number of the errors and then the nature of those errors. And third, and the bottom line question for all of this is, has the essence of the Christian faith been changed by the scribes? If it has, then we're on shaky foundation. Let's see how we can deal with these. The first questions are going to take far and away the majority of our time. And so don't feel panicky if I get to 45 minutes into the lecture or more on this first question. I start with a preliminary question. Don't we have the original New Testament anymore? The answer to that is no, we don't. The original 27 books were dispatched to various people and congregations in the ancient world, and they would have been copied and read from earliest times, first by non-professional, not professionally trained scribes, but by scribes who were good at perhaps accounting. And I won't get into the details here, but it's a really interesting thing that some of the earliest scribes were actually accountants. They were number crunchers, if you will. They weren't creative people, but they were very accurate in what they did. And we have actual evidence in the New Testament manuscripts that's unlike anything else from ancient Greek literature that tells us that's the kind of scribes that the New Testament was often copied by. But we don't have the originals anymore. They would have certainly worn out within a century of being written. And now let's say, okay, what if we did have the originals? Well, we probably would never get a chance to see them. They'd be put in some treasury someplace, like the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia. Well, it's in a place that nobody can see, so nobody can verify it. That is not the Christian faith. The tomb was empty not to let Jesus out, but so that the disciples could see that he was no longer there. Our faith is grounded in history, but it's also shrouded in mystery. And maintaining that balance is something that all believers have to learn to do. So what if all the copies we had, though, agreed exactly 100%? That would tell us that, okay, they agreed. That doesn't necessarily tell us what the original said. But our copies actually disagree quite a bit. In fact, the two closest manuscripts we have in the first 800 years of the Christian faith have between 6 and 10 differences per chapter. Now, if they had been complete New Testaments, that would be about 2,000 differences for the whole New Testament. That's the two closest in the first 8 centuries, which is when we're going to find our best and most important witnesses. So because of the disappearance of the originals and the disagreements of the copies, we have to do what's called textual criticism, trying to recover the wording of the original on the basis of the extant evidence. Now, here's one way to put all this in perspective in terms of the numbers. And this is to scale. A lot of the things I'll put up here are to scale, but not everything. This is to scale. Words in the New Testament. We have approximately 138,162 words in the original Greek New Testament, give or take about a dozen. There's some variance in terms of latest scholarly editions that might have a few more words or fewer words than we had otherwise. How many textual differences do we have among the manuscripts? Before we get into that, let me define what a textual difference is, or a textual variant. It's any place where just one manuscript has a difference from the base text. Even spelling difference counts. Now, if that one manuscript is joined by another 1,000 manuscripts that disagree with the base text, and they all have that same word that's different from the base text, that still counts as only one variant. It's not, it would not count as 1,000 variants, and there are evangelicals in the past, responsible authors who have said a textual variant is any place where there are differences, and every textual variant is counted not only by the number of differences, but the number of manuscripts that go with it. And Chris, maybe you can put up my blog where I said an evangelical miscalculation about the number of variants. It's been going around since 1963 in a particular book that's been quoted and then used. It's got over 1 million copies, and it just gets the numbers all wrong. So you understand, any textual variant is any place where you have at least one manuscript that differs from the base text, and it doesn't matter how many copies you have that agree with that disagreement. How many differences do we have? This is to scale. Let me give you the numbers. We have approximately 1.5 million differences among our manuscripts when we have only 138,162 words in the New Testament. Bart Ehrman has said we have more differences in the manuscripts when we have words in the original New Testament. That's one of the few times where he's made a gross understatement. It's about 10 times more differences than what the original said text has. That's just stunning to comprehend. And we'll show a little bit of how these differences work out. But if this is the only piece of data we had, we might as well just give up. In my first year of Greek in college, I had 4 years of Greek in college before I went to seminary. Towards the end of one of the first few weeks of first year Greek, the professor said, at the time there were known of about 150,000 variants. He said, you know, we've got about 150,000 variants in our Greek manuscripts. And so what you have is the Greek text you're translating may not be the original in every place. And that sent me into an existential crisis that weekend. He said it on Friday. And so I'm stewing over this until the next class day, and then he explained it. And what he explained briefly, I'm going to explain in much greater detail. This is not the only piece of data we need to look at, but it's an important one for us to wrestle with. Years ago, I said there were probably as many as 400,000 variants. That was the best guess that we had at the time. But again, one of my former interns, Peter Gurry, wrote an article in New Testament Studies on the number of variants in the New Testament manuscripts. And he came up with the best estimate we have. We don't have the exact count because not all of the manuscripts have been examined in great detail. The earliest have been examined, but not the later ones. But we're getting so much farther down the field. There's still a lot of work to be done in this discipline. So if you're at all interested in working in the text of the New Testament, this is a great place for you to think about working on it. So now let's see, where was I? I have these old man brain farts from time to time, and it's a Thursday, so I'm going to have more than usual today. Okay, so Peter Gurry came up with about 500,000 variants, and he did it on the basis of looking at the places where there has been a complete study of all the variants for, say, a particular chapter or a particular book of the New Testament. And extrapolating that out, he came up with 500,000. So how can I say 1.5 million? Because Gurry left out spelling differences and nonsense wording, which occupy about 2/3 of all the differences. You cut those out, now we're down to 500,000. Okay, let's start thinking about some of the issues here. Why do we have so many differences? I love this quote by C.S. Lewis in his book, Miracles. The moment the miracle enters nature's realm, it obeys all her laws. Miraculous wine will intoxicate. Miraculous conception will lead to pregnancy. Inspired books will suffer all the ordinary processes of textual corruption. Miraculous bread will be digested. In other words, once the biblical authors write scripture, as soon as it's copied, there will be mistakes in the copies. That's how it has always been with how miracles work. But why are there so many variants? What did they do to our confidence in the Bible? Let me quote a scholar from 300 years ago, Richard Bentley, who was a scholar at Cambridge University. And he wrote a book called The Remarks Upon a Discourse of Free Thinking. Now, let me give you a little background. Bentley was one of the best textual critics, the best textual critic of his day, where he began to think about the New Testament text in ways that were light years ahead of his time, where some of the work that he did actually has come to the same views that scholars have come to today, even though we have just vastly more manuscripts to look at than he ever even conceived of. So he was responding to critics to a book written in 1707 by John Mill. And I don't think I have any pictures of that because I wanted to keep this close to an hour. But in 1707, John Mill spent his entire adult life at Oxford University as a professor, and he worked on one book. He got it published just 2 weeks before he died. It was his magnum opus, the thing he would be remembered for from that day forth. He died exactly 2 weeks to the day after it was published, which is perfect timing. When I write my magnum opus, and I'm getting close to the age when I'm going to pass into the next world, I hope that I die just 2 weeks after I publish it, because then I can avoid all the critics and they come out of the woodwork. John Mill looked at 99 Greek New Testament manuscripts and other ancient translations and quotations by church fathers, and he produced this huge volume with an apparatus with footnotes that tended to take up more space than the actual text that he was printing. Now, Mill looked at every single Greek New Testament manuscript that he could get a hold of, and he produced 30,000 textual variants in that document. What he published, the Greek text he published, was called the Textus Receptus. It had been around for 200 years, first published by Erasmus. He was the first one to publish a Greek New Testament on a printing press. That was in 1516. And then this was kind of the standard that was used just out of atrophy. Nobody knew enough about textual criticism to look at older manuscripts and produce a better text. So it was just kind of the standard by way of just, I don't want to call it apathy, but it was just such enormous work to do otherwise. So Bentley produces this Textus Receptus. That's the Greek New Testament that stands behind the King James. And then when there were 30,000 variants revealed, there were people who were screaming at them, evangelicals, conservative Christians. And what they were doing was saying, John Mill, you've done the work of the devil. How dare you question what the Bible actually says? Friends, I got to tell you, historical research is never the work of the devil. The Bible is the only sacred text of any major religion that subjects itself to historical verifiability, subjects itself to historical investigation. Does the Bhagavad Gita or the teachings of the compassionate Buddha or the Quran do that? No, of course not. The Gospel of Thomas is just talking head. There's no places mentioned. There's no miracles that are done. There's no people apart from the disciples that are mentioned. So all these things are removed from historical investigation, but not so with the Bible. We actually know the very place where Peter's house was in the first century. I've been to it a few times. So has Chris. He's been there at least once. And it's one of the most secure sites that we have. We know where the resurrection occurred. We know where Jesus was buried. There's so many sites that we know because the Bible subjects itself to this, and we can do this investigation. So the Bible puts itself at risk. You can look at the material and decide you don't believe it. Or you can look at it and decide, in part, on the basis of evidence, but also a step of faith, not a leap of faith, but a step of faith, that you do believe it. Remember, the Bible, our faith, is grounded in history, but it's also shrouded in mystery. That's the balance we need to maintain. So you have these conservative Christians, Protestants, who said, John Mill, you did the work of the devil. Meanwhile, Roman Catholics were just ecstatic about John Mill's text. Why? Because they could make fun of Christians. You guys have a paper pope, and he disagrees with himself in many places on every single page. Meanwhile, our pope speaks ex cathedra. Richard Bentley responded to both of these things, and this is just a great little statement he's got in Remarks upon a Discourse of Free Thinking. If there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament at the Restoration of Learning about 2 centuries ago, he's talking about when Erasmus published that first New Testament, then we would have had no various readings at all. And would the text be in a better condition then than it is now, that we have 30,000 variant readings? It is good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. I think the next time I'm going to speak in a public place about these issues, if I have at least a couple of hours to do so, I'm going to do an experiment that I've not yet done. I've done a lot of things that are similar to this, but not this particular thing. I'll read a chapter from an ancient document, and I'll have everybody in the audience write down what I said. No talking. They can't talk to each other. They just write it down. And then I'll collect all those documents afterwards. And I'll give them to an assistant who did not know what I actually said. And have that assistant try to figure out exactly what I said on that occasion. And my guess is, because he would understand, or she would understand, the principles of textual criticism on how to sift through the manuscripts on the basis of what looks to be a superior reading. I'm sorry, I'm getting way too much of the details here. I wish I had 3 hours for this tonight, but I think they could come very close, if not exactly reproduce what I originally said. Okay. This is what Bentley is talking about. But we have more than just a dozen manuscripts or 30,000 variants. We have a lot more. So the more we have, the better off we're at, actually. We have today, the latest official count is 5,711 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Now, the vast majority of these are only partial. Most of them, we have 2,500, the largest portion have the Gospels in them, sometimes more than the Gospels, like the Gospels in Paul's letters or the Gospels in Acts or the Gospels in the general epistles or the Gospels in Revelation or something like that. And they're about 1% of all of our manuscripts have the whole New Testament in them. Other times you'll have manuscripts that just have Paul's letters or Paul and the generals and general letters and this kind of thing. But the average sized manuscript is over 400 pages long, the average size. And we have the same for the other manuscripts in Latin and these other ancient translations. Actually, they're a little bit larger than our Greek manuscripts. The New Testament began to get translated into other languages as early as the late 2nd century and the 3rd century. Latin, Coptic, Syriac, the three most important versions have thousands among manuscripts among them. And then we have a number of other ancient versions, so that we have between 20 and 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament before the time of the printing press in these various languages, including the original Greek. If you had a magic wand and could destroy all of those manuscripts in one fell swoop, we still would not be left without a witness. And that's because we have quotations from the church fathers of the New Testament. Starting in the early 20th century, there was an institute in Boiron, Germany, that has been collecting these quotations. And by the 1930s, they had come up with more than 1 million quotations of the New Testament by the church fathers. I have no idea what the number is up to now, but they said they haven't gone very far down the centuries to collect these. Sorry, I'm going to have to, every once in a while, spray my throat because I get a little sore throat when I've been talking like this. Apologies. Now, let's do a comparison of the New Testament to the average classical work. The average classical Greek writer has fewer than 15 copies of his or her work still in existence. You stack them up, they're about 4 feet high. Now, that's the average. If we were to compare it visually, probably a podium would be the best thing to use for the average classical author. Stack up the books, about 3.5, probably 4 feet high at most for the average again. The New Testament, what would be the thing to use? Well, I think the Empire State Building is a good way to do this. Now, this next screen is to scale. The average classical work, I hope you can see that dot on your screen. It's a dot, a pixel. It's 4 feet tall. How tall would the manuscripts of the New Testament be? Stacking them all up. The Empire State Building, with its antenna at the top, goes up 1,454 feet. And this is to scale also. Obviously, we have a little bit more room than that. So let's see how tall that stack of New Testament manuscripts would be. It's a mile high before you even reach the 4th Empire State Building, and as much as 6,230 feet high as once you reach into the 5th Empire State Building. I think we can say with a pretty strong sense of certainty, the number of manuscripts that we have in the New Testament in all these ancient languages, if you stacked them up, would be more than a mile high. Now, that is something that's astounding. We could also say this in terms of the number of witnesses. If we want to doubt that we can get back to the New Testament because the manuscripts are not original, and we have the manuscripts come later, and how many are there and all this, that doubt would need to be multiplied 1,000-fold for the average classical author. We have 1,000 times more evidence for the New Testament, at least, than we do for these other classical authors. All right. Well, now let's look at somebody who's more, wrong Homer. Sorry. This Homer. Yep. I'm gonna mention a few historians and one poet in the next few slides. Homer, he was not a historian, but he was a poet, and he wrote things about wars and all this. And his Iliad was the most popular book in the ancient Greek world. Here he lives in the 8th century BC. He was blind, so he didn't write it down, but what his plays were did get recorded. And today, we have about 2,200 copies of Homer's Iliad. The oldest copy, the oldest complete copy, I should say, is from the 10th century AD, about 1,700 years after Homer lived. That's the oldest complete copy. We have a number of papyri that have been discovered in the last 75 years. That's about 1,700 papyri, but they still are coming 400 or 500 years later before you get to the earliest one. And every single one of them is fragmentary. So we're waiting 1,700 years before we get our oldest complete copy of the Iliad, of the number one most popular Greek author of the ancient world. He was so popular that his Iliad was required reading of all schoolboys in Greece for centuries. Alexander the Great, when he went on his campaigns to destroy and conquer the world, always had a copy of the Iliad with him. Homer has an 800-year head start over the New Testament and still reaches only about 1/10 of the copies of the New Testament. Herodotus and Thucydides are considered the two fathers of history, if you will. His histories, there's 109 manuscripts, I believe, but the first substantial one is 1,500 years after he lived. He's 5th century BC. Xenophon's Hellenica, his first substantial manuscripts, we do have some papyrus fragments up until this point, come almost 1,800 years after he lived. That's just stunning when you think about this. Two historians. And then you've got Pindar, one of the 9 great poets of Greece, who lives in the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Pindar's poems were the most popular of all, and yet we don't even have all of his poems. Some of them we just have in fragments. Some of them we only hear about them. Pindar's lyric poetry he's the number one poet of the ancient Greek world. The oldest substantial copies come from the 13th and 16th centuries AD. There's one 13th and one 16th, and neither one of them has exactly the same material as the other, but the 16th is more complete. That's the century that the printing press was begun to be used. It was created in the 15th century by Gutenberg. Okay, so if we had copies of the New Testament where our oldest substantial ones came this much later than Xenophon's Hellenica or Pindar's poems, the first substantial copies would be about the time when the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Now think about that. You go into Starbucks and you're talking to somebody, you meet a friend and he says, how can I possibly trust that the New Testament you have today even remotely goes back? Haven't there been copies of copies and copies of copies hundreds of times? We can't possibly tell what the original said. Well, he'd have something to argue for if our oldest New Testament manuscripts of any substantial length came at the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, this is those scholars who look at the New Testament text only very, very rarely have examined other classical literature. It's embarrassing how little they know about that. Once you make the comparison, there is no comparison. Okay, well, we've got a lot of manuscripts, And we've talked about that they don't come 1800 years later. When do we have these manuscripts? Let me talk to you about the discovery of papyrus number 52, discovered in 1934. There was a young papyrologist who was an up-and-coming papyrologist who was bequeathed some manuscripts that had been excavated, I think, in 1920 from Egypt. And he was looking through these papyri. Now, papyrus, material written on papyrus had been known since the 1700s. It had been known when, I'll just leave that out. I'm sorry, I'm getting into too many details and nobody's here. I wish my wife were here to say, hey, you're talking too long and you got a long ways to go. But anyway, this will probably go more than an hour. I hope, well, you guys can all get coffee and things. I'm not hearing you, so do what you need to hang in there. P52. This is a fragment of John's Gospel written. This scholar, C.H. Roberts, estimated between AD 100 and 150. Now, there are some who want to date it a little bit later, maybe as late as 175. But I think what Roberts discovered, the dates 100 to 150 are really far more accurate. The closest manuscript he found, a dated manuscript, was written in 94. That's by far the closest one. It's about the size of a credit card. When he saw this, he was astounded. This Greek is a very decent hand, and it's easy to read. It's black ink. It's at Manchester University in England right now. That's where he was working. It's interesting. The manuscripts on the text written on papyrus is often easier to read than that written on later parchment, because on parchment, they had to use iron ore ink. It had iron in it. So iron gall, I think is what it was called. And with iron in it, it's going to rust. Parchment, which they start out with a white sheet, it turns brown over time. And so you got parchment leaf that is light brown, and you've got the ink that is dark brown on top of it. At times, it's very difficult to read. But if a papyrus is in good shape, you can read it easily because of the black ink. So here's what he discovered. On one side of this papyrus, it has John 18, verses 31 through 33. Remarkable. But then he flipped it over, and on the back side, it had John 18, 37 and 38. Now, what this told C.H. Roberts was that this manuscript was not on a scroll or a roll, but it was written on a codex, which is the precursor to our modern book form, bound on one side with cut pages that you can flip and turn. And we actually know the size of this codex. We know how the size of the pages. A lot of research has been done on this. But he actually, literally, 40 years later, wrote the book on the birth of the codex. That was the title of the book that he wrote with another great textual scholar, T.C. Skeet. So the birth of the codex, I think it's been reprinted, and it's an excellent work to get. Okay, so it was 50 years later, not 40, sorry. What Roberts discovered was that the codex form, although it was invented sometime around the middle or late first century, really was hardly used. It was used for wax tablets and that kind of thing. But written on actual material, like papyrus, which was the book form of the day, no, it just wasn't done. The oldest manuscript we have written on a codex, in fact, is this very papyrus number 52. And for the next 500 years, through the first 5 centuries of the Christian era, over 90% of all Christian books were written on a codex. While for the rest of the world, all the books that we have discovered from the ancient papyrus heaps in Egypt up through about AD 500 and elsewhere, parchment books and all this, less than 15% of them were written on a codex. The rest were rolls. So the first time, and perhaps only time, in the history of the church, Christians were actually ahead of the technological curve. Well, this excited Roberts, especially because of what had happened 90 years earlier. I'll get to that. I'm sorry. Let me mention that. No slides on this. 90 years earlier, 1844, F.C. Bauer, who became the father of theological liberalism in Germany, wrote in a publication that the Gospel of John could not have been written any earlier than AD 160. He believed it was written in 170. Now, he went through all sorts of philosophical argumentation called Hegelian dialectic. We won't get into that at all. But he was certain of that. For the next 90 years, there was virtually no one in Europe who said John's gospel was from the first century. Now, if it's as late as 170, it certainly wasn't written by an eyewitness, and certainly it's not going to have historically reliable information. This particular manuscript, P52, sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. Remarkable discovery. It reminds me of a saying that William Lane had on his desk: an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. Now, if we look at the other manuscripts that are early, I'm not going to go through this list. I'll just note that we have as many as a dozen manuscripts of the New Testament, Greek manuscripts only, I'm counting, as many as a dozen from the 2nd century, between 100 and 200. By the time you get to the 10th century, so 900 years after the New Testament is completed, we have almost 1,000 manuscripts. The next century, the 11th, that number doubles to 1,800. What's significant here is that within 900 years of the New Testament's completion, we have almost 1,000 manuscripts in Greek alone. And several hundred years before any copies of the average classical author's writings are extant. It just blows you away. It doesn't matter how you slice this. We have more evidence. We have earlier evidence. We have more complete evidence than anything else in the ancient world. So we're wrapping up question number 1 right now. Has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times that we don't know what it originally said? In 1611, the year the King James Bible came out, it was based essentially on 9 Greek manuscripts that were the basis for Erasmus's Textus Receptus. Now, a few others have been discovered. They were added a little bit here and there. But the earliest of these manuscripts was 11th century. King James Bible, 17th century, so 600 years earlier are the oldest manuscripts that they used. Today, 2026, we have more than 5,700 in Greek alone, and the oldest ones go back to the 2nd century. So as time goes on, we are getting closer and closer to the original text. It's absolutely remarkable to think about that. Okay, that's question 1. Now I'm going to have to keep using the throat spray as the voice is giving out pretty quickly here. What kinds of textual variations are there? This is the nature. Over 99% make virtually no difference at all. For example, there's differences in spelling. And some of you may not have even noticed that error, differences in spelling. In the ancient world, they didn't have a dictionary that said, here's how you spell words. So there were a few ways to spell it, and often it was due to regional pronunciation. But that's the number 1 most common textual difference among our manuscripts, is spelling differences. As I said, about 2/3 of all the differences are spelling or nonsense differences. Now, some of you have had a little bit of Greek, and I did an experiment. I did this 13 years ago when I was lecturing on this up in Oklahoma. How many ways are there to say John loves Mary in Greek? Now, there's things to consider. Word order difference. You can put those 3 words in any order you want. Greek is a highly inflected language. You can tell who the subject is and who the object is by the endings on those words. Then the Greek definite article that goes with proper names. There's more articles in the Greek New Testament. There's 20,000 of them in the New Testament. 1 out of 7 words is the article. If you learn the article, you've gotten 1/7 of your vocabulary down. Now you got to get the other 5,000 words down, but 1/7 of the occurrences, I should say. So the Greek article occurs with proper names at times. The John loves the Mary. John loves the Mary. The John loves Mary, or no article with either one. I wrote my master's thesis on when the article does not occur in a particular construction. And I wrote my doctoral dissertation on when it does occur in a particular construction. Those 2 works, both of them have been published, would cure the most hopeless insomniac. Today, I don't know why the article is used with proper names. There have been some hypotheses, but nothing has really stuck yet with scholars. It doesn't seem to change anything. It's a mystery to us, but there's nothing that's really at stake on it. And then there's differences in spelling. John can be spelled 2 different ways in Greek. Mary can be spelled 5 different ways. So you look at this, and now I can't put this up in English, otherwise everyone would say John loves Mary. None of these say Mary is loved by John. Everyone says John loves Mary. 8 different ways to say it. Oh, there's another 8. I hope you're writing this down because it'll show up on the quiz, but let's keep going. 96 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek without changing the meaning at all. The only thing that changes is a slight emphasis. It's the same word for loves each time. But there's often conjunctions that are untranslated in Greek. In fact, on Greek quizzes, the answer to the quiz, I'll give a vocabulary word, and the answer may be an untranslated contingent particle. If you give an actual translation, it's wrong because it can't be translated. So I literally worked for 8 hours in one day to come up with all the ways I could do this. These are all different, I assure you, but because of time, well, I've never gone through this really slowly. 384 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek without changing the meaning, using the same verb each time. When I got done with those 384 ways, 8 hours of work, and I verified all these are different, I realized, I haven't gotten all of them. There's a bunch of these others. There's over 500 ways to say it. And then I completely forgot about a paraphrastic construction that doubles it, over 2,000 ways to say it. And you get a different verb for loves, and it mushrooms to over 2,000 ways. So it's remarkable how many ways you can say that in Greek without changing the meaning. So what's the point of this silly exercise? Well, Barb Norman says we could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the text of the New Testament came to be changed, either accidentally or intentionally. The examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. Well, he's right. But if we can say John loves Mary over 1,000 times in Greek without changing the meaning, the number of textual variants for the New Testament is meaningless. What counts is the nature of the variants. And here's where we get into some details, specific details. There's 4 ways you can think about these variants. And since you'll be able to see these slides later, although I am asking that they not be downloaded, they're proprietary, and I don't want you to download these, but you can review the video anytime you need to. There are 4 categories using the matrix and meaning of meaningful and viable. A viable variant means it actually could go back to the original. It has some plausibility. Maybe it's not great, but it has some possibility of going back to the original. Meaningful means it changes the meaning somehow. It could be very, very slight. Like if you have in John 4:1, we have, now when Jesus knew that the Pharisees had heard, the verse goes on after that, or when the Lord knew. When Jesus knew or when the Lord knew. There's no variants that say when Peter knew or John or James or Andrew knew. It's always when Jesus knew or the Lord knew. That's a viable, meaningful variant. So that fits into our less than 1% category. But the meaningful one is where you change the translation for one thing, and there's a number of them that are meaningful where the translation isn't even changed, but there are some features in Greek that an expositor is going to bring out. There are those that are not meaningful and not viable. That's the largest circle here. And then the ones that are viable and not meaningful, that's that part of that circle in that square. Meaningful but not viable. There's a number of those that are meaningful but not viable. And then the smallest by far, and this is not to scale, are those that are meaningful and viable. It's that red dot in that little section of the circle. The smallest group of variants, meaningful and viable, it's actually less than 0.1% of all textual variants fit this group. That's absolutely stunning. Less than 0.1% of all textual variants are both meaningful and viable. So now we've reduced that massive number that sounded so scary to begin with to a small fraction of that number. And yet, how meaningful are they? Well, let me give you some examples of kinds of variants. I'll start with an illustration. The preamble to the Constitution begins with, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." Now, if you were hand copying this in school back in the early 1800s, and you're in fourth grade and you're writing it out, and perhaps instead of union, you wrote onion, that would be an obvious mistake that your teacher could tell you, "Oh, no, you don't mean onion, you meant union." That's the kind of mistakes that we see all the time. That's far and away the most common kind of mistake that we do see in the manuscripts, is those that are unintentional, and we can figure out what was actually meant. Now, I'll give you one in 1 Thessalonians 2:7 that is probably unintentional, but actually does make sense. And so in that respect, it could be meaningful. I just don't know. I'm not sure. But anyway, in 1 Thessalonians 2:7, Paul says, "Although we could have imposed our weight as apostles of Christ, instead we became either gentle among you or little children among you." Both of these variants are meaningful, and both are actually viable. There's a lot of literature on both of these. There's a whole book on this textual problem. Little children versus gentle in Greek is the difference between the word napioi and apioi. It's a one-letter difference. It's napioi versus apioi. That's the Greek. Okay, now, there's one late manuscript, about 14th century, that doesn't have napioi, doesn't have apioi. It has hippoi, horses. "We became horses among you." I wonder if it's a disgruntled USC Trojans fan or something. I don't know, but it's a funny variant. There's others that I've seen that are just hilarious, but they don't really affect anything. Now I'm going to give you two textual problems where the differences are meaningful and are viable. And there's plenty of others, and I think during the Q&A, some of these are going to be coming up. In Mark chapter 9, verse 29, Jesus said to his disciples after a man said his son was thrown into the fire by a demon, and they couldn't cast the demon out. And so Jesus says to the disciples, "This kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting," or just by prayer. There's a textual variant here. A number of significant manuscripts have prayer. A number of significant ones have prayer and fasting. Now, most of you probably have not been involved in any exorcisms. I've actually been involved in two, not of persons, but of houses. And each time the exorcism was successful. But before I went, because I'm not sure which one of these wordings is original, I had to hedge my bet a little bit. So I not only prayed, but I also fasted before I went to do these house exorcisms. I just want to make sure that I cover my bases well. As far as I can tell, this is the only text where fasting is considered required for some activity of the Christian life and affects our orthopraxy. It's the only textual variant or orthopraxy, not orthodoxy, not what we believe, but what we actually do, what the Christian practice is all about. It actually affects it. So in that sense, a very important textual problem. I still lean towards it saying just prayer, but nevertheless, we have to deal with these things. And so I can't be 100% sure that even my Greek New Testament has exactly the words of the original. Revelation 13:18 is another one. Let the one who has insight calculate the beast's number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Is that really his number? What's interesting, that in the 1840s, a scholar named Constantin Tischendorf went to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and transcribed a manuscript from the late 4th, early 5th century that had originally the whole New Testament and Old Testament in it. From about the year 400, it had the whole Bible in it originally. This manuscript had been scraped over very diligently by someone centuries later, and there was text written on top of it diagonally. So Tischendorf spent 2 years going through every page of this manuscript, reading it, deciphering it as best he could. And after 2 years, he published what he could read, 99% of the text. Now, they had applied some chemicals to it to make that undertext come out. And I've actually had the opportunity to examine this manuscript in the flesh. It's known as Codex C or Ephraemi Rescriptus. And as sure as there is the sun in daytime, at Revelation 13:18, it says the number of the beast is 616. It's interesting that this manuscript, Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, has become one of the 2 most important manuscripts for establishing the text of Revelation. The other one has 666. Now, there's a third manuscript that is right behind these 2. It's the third most important manuscript we have for Revelation, and that is P115. It was recently discovered, published in 1998, and it has 20. It's fragmentary. We have 26 postage stamp size fragments spread out over 9 chapters in Revelation. And I had an opportunity to look at that in the flesh too. I saw it 4 years after it was published. And I saw it under a magnifying glass, and then I looked at it under a microscope. And it also has 616 as the number of the beast. Now, these are the only 2 manuscripts that have the number of the beast as 616. But they're 2 of the most important manuscripts for Revelation. Now, I've wrestled with this back and forth. I've done some blogs about it. There's others. Some are convinced 616, that's the number of the beast. Others 666, that's the number. I wake up on Tuesdays, and the first thing I'm thinking, the number of the beast, 666. And then Thursday, my doubts come around. No, maybe it's 616. Maybe that's how you all wake up from your night's sleep as well. But here's the interesting thing. Most scholars would say, no, 666, that's the number of the beast. 616, he's the neighbor of the beast. He just lives a few doors down. But I don't know of a single Bible college, denomination, seminary, Christian group, except for the ones that are way, way out there on the fringe, that put in their doctrinal statement, and the number of the beast is 666. It may be meaningful, 666 or 616. It may be viable. Either variant is viable, but it's not that meaningful. It's not that important. So finally, we come to the last question. That is, what theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? Going back to Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, when Sir Lee Teabing declares to Sophie, my dear, until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, a mortal. speaking about the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. And here's the bust of Emperor Constantine, who at least initiated it and came at the end of the council. The Council of Nicaea defined what the deity of Christ meant. And Dan Brown and Al-Azami and many skeptics claim that the Council of Nicaea was the first time that Jesus was ever considered God in the flesh. Well, remember I said an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption? Here's an ounce of evidence, P66, which actually has quite a few leaves. It has most of John's gospel in it, and it's dated in the 3rd century, early 3rd century. Some dated it as early as 150 to begin with, but it's probably a little later. This is the first page of it, Gospel according to John. Read along with me, if you would, in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, you've never heard that before until the Council of Nicaea made it so, but you never knew any manuscripts before that could say it, because Dan Brown and others have said, no, they can't. They don't. Unless Constantine was 150 years old, I think the deity of Christ was already clearly seen in a number of manuscripts prior to the council. Not just manuscripts, early church fathers, the versions, just tons of evidence. Every single manuscript of John's gospel, no matter the date or the language, says the same thing in John 1:1. Jesus is unequivocally called God. And the rest can be said, the same can be said for the major passages that affirm Christ's deity, his virgin birth, his sinlessness, his death on a cross, his bodily resurrection, and his second coming. And there are no manuscripts that deny these things. That's the amazing thing. Some will maybe not affirm it, like in 1 Timothy 3:16, I think it says, now confessedly great is the mystery of godliness. And it goes on in the original text, I believe, says, who was revealed in the flesh. Later manuscripts change that to God was revealed in the flesh. It's really easy to change one to the other. It's just two horizontal strokes to make a God out of who in Greek. But the who does not deny the deity of Christ. It just doesn't affirm it there. And we don't have manuscripts that deny any of these major passages. Some would go so far as to say there's not any shred of orthodoxy that is undercut by any variance at all. Now, not a single viable variant contradicts any of these beliefs and the other cardinal beliefs of the faith, is what I would say. Let me conclude with this. Sir Frederick Kenyon was a paleographer extraordinaire, and he was the principal librarian of the British Museum. Paleographer is the one who studies ancient manuscripts and determines their dates and deciphers their data by close examination. He published a lot of papyri and other things like this. He wrote this book 90 years ago, and he said, the general result of all these discoveries and all this study is to strengthen the proof of the authenticity of the scriptures and our conviction that we have in our hands in substantial integrity the veritable word of God. Friends, that's a great line to remember. We have in our hands in substantial integrity the veritable word of God. We have in all the majors and in the vast majority of the particulars the veritable word of God in our hands today. Well, I'm quoting a Christian. What about non-Christians? I'll end with this. Bart Ehrman, in his book, Misquoting Jesus, I've already quoted a couple times out of his book, published in 2005, and the first 3 months he sold 100,000 copies, I believe. The publisher HarperCollins wanted it to keep going, and so they added a paperback version. And in the paperback version, they added an appendix. If you go to Half Price Books, you'll see in the paperback edition, you're going to have the section that was added it's gray on the outside of the leaf, so you'll know that's the appendix. And they wanted to just beef it up, ask some more personal questions of Roman. And here's one of the things that's fascinating about this. To me, the most fascinating thing of this appendix. The editors of this book, a book that had left so many Christians becoming Christian littles about their Christian faith, chicken littles, not Christian littles, chicken littles, yeah, I guess they are Christian littles, had abandoned the faith because of misquoting Jesus. And the editors, believing that Bart Ehrman has absolutely destroyed Christianity, in the appendix, they ask him this question: why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? Notice they don't say, do you believe? They assume he believes it. They read his book carefully. They edited his book. And when they asked him this question point blank, look at his response. Page 252 of the appendix. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Did you catch that? They're saying, why do you believe that these tenets of orthodoxy are destroyed, jeopardized by these variants? And when he was asked this point blank, he said essential Christian beliefs are not affected by these textual variants. In fact, he goes on to say, they ask him another question. You and Professor Metzger are poles apart as far as your theological convictions are concerned. He's an evangelical Christian. You're a theological liberal and an atheist to boot. Now, if we were to lock you two guys in a room and you could not come out of that room until you hammered out your differences as to what the original New Testament said. This, by the way, is also on page 252. How many differences do you think you'd have? And Ehrman said, oh, no more than about 1 or 2 dozen. 2 dozen, 24 differences, something like that. His words were no more than 1 or 2 dozen. That's remarkable. I said we've got 1/10 of 1% of all the textual variants would be considered viable and meaningful. That's actually 1,500 places. But how much is really at stake? Not a whole lot. But for most textual critics, that number is reduced down to 200 or 300. And between Ehrman and Metzger, it's 1 or 2 dozen. That's incredible. Now, I'm going to finish with an unnatural segue. A polar bear attacks a man in Canada and bystanders do nothing. The media don't even report this incident. So I want you to close your eyes for a second and envision what you close them right now. I'm not going to put up the next slide till I tell you. What do you envision of a polar bear attacking a man? Hope you didn't have dinner recently because I'm going to put up a real picture. Are you ready? Here goes. That's the polar bear attacking a man in Canada. What did it do? Well, your image may have been a little bit different. He may have pulled out a thread of the guy's 501 blues, but that's it. When you think about the attacks on Scripture by these atheists, when you think about the nonsense of the arguments that they come up with, when you think about the skeptics and how they say, well, we don't even have the original text, how can we get back to it? Those kinds of arguments. And when you think about the 1.5 million textual variants, I want your mind immediately to picture this polar bear cub gnawing on the guy's blue jeans. Thank you so much, my friends, for listening to me for now, I guess, an hour and a half.